Okay, cool. We're live. Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm the TA for the course Climate Action. I'm here for our first live.
Okay,
Nope.
cool. We're live.
Hi,
I'm Jenny. I'm the TA for the course Climate Action. I'm here for our first.
Sorry, technical difficulties. So I'm here for our first live session with Dr. Bill Horak. So we'll be discussing low emissions energy technologies. Bill, can you please introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name is Bill Horak. I work at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, which is one of 12 multi-purpose laboratories funded by the United States Department of Energy. I work in the Nuclear Science and Technology Department, where I work on advanced nuclear energy systems. Our work mainly is connected right now with what are called small modular reactors and microreactors. But in the past, I've worked working on foreign design reactors, especially over in Russia and in the former Soviet Union. My background is actually was not originally nuclear. I was an aeronautical engineer. I became very interested in a thing called electromagnetic thrusters, which are used on various satellites like the Dawn satellite, which is currently circling the asteroid Ceres. But that got me interested in nuclear fusion. While I was studying nuclear fusion, they informed me that it would be 50 years before fusion became practical. That was 50 years ago, and it's not here yet. So I changed and decided I was going to be working on combined cycle gas turbines, which kind of indirectly led me to nuclear.
All right. So can you explain quickly how nuclear technology works? Like, what is the difference between nuclear fission and fusion, and why is it that we have one technology but not the other?
Okay, so basically in nuclear fission, what we do is we use a process that involves releasing energy which is trapped in the nucleus of atoms. And it's actually trapped in all atoms greater than iron. But it turns out it's easiest to get it out for two elements, uranium and plutonium. This was developed during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project. And what it does is when those atoms break apart, they release energy as heat. And we use that heat to normally boil a liquid, normally water, but can be other things such as liquid sodium, what we call molten salts. And then we just follow the normal process that we would do, for example, with a gas turbine or a coal plant, and use the steam to turn a turbine, which then generates electricity. Fusion, on the other hand, is for all the elements which are lighter than iron, and in them we combine them together, and in that case we also release energy. The problem is that to do that is very, very difficult. We have to hold the atoms together at very, very high pressures and temperatures, and long enough that they don't fly apart. And so far, we have not been successful in doing that for large periods of time. The next step up we're going to try doing that with is going to be in France. It's called ITER, which stands for International Tokamak Energy Reactor. And that's scheduled to go online in the next 5 to 10 years. That will probably, that its target is to be the first reactor that has a sustained nuclear fusion long enough that produces more energy than it takes to jam these fusion molecules, fusion atoms together. So that's why we don't have fusion yet, except in one place, which we do harvest all the time, which is the sun. The sun is a gigantic fusion reactor, and we have successfully learned to harness the energy that does come from that here on Earth.
All right, that was a really good explanation of very complicated science. So you said that the way that nuclear power works is that it's basically, as it exists right now, it's breaking apart atoms. So just to confirm, there's no emission of like other compounds like carbon dioxide, for example, right?
No, there is not in the fission process itself. Okay. However, in building the nuclear reactors that are used to do this process, we of course have a carbon footprint. There's also carbon footprint in what we call the fuel cycle, which is the mining of the uranium, the turning it into fuel pellets, and ultimately the disposal of it. So, although the fissioning doesn't produce any carbon dioxide in substantial amounts or measurable amounts, the construction and the making of the fuel has a carbon footprint.
All right. So I guess just moving along to the life cycle impact of nuclear. Can you explain the life cycle impact and how it compares to other sources of energy, such as fossil fuels, solar, wind, or hydro?
Yeah. So basically, in my lecture, I put up a slide, which I think you have, Jenny, right? Do you bring up that slide?
Sure.
Okay. So basically, the one of our sister laboratories, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is in Boulder, Colorado, did a study of studies, and they compared the carbon footprint of various generation schemes by looking at other studies that had been done and kind of mapping them. Now, where the harmonization part comes in is that different studies will make different assumptions. Like for nuclear, a person might make a different assumption as to how long the nuclear power plant will operate. And with your carbon footprint for nuclear being tied up in the construction, obviously, the longer it operates, the more reduction in your carbon footprint you would get per kilowatt of energy. So basically, if you look at this graph, to the left-hand side are the renewable energies. They're photovoltaics, concentrating solar power, wind, and then nuclear. And you'll see two graphs for each technology. One is the raw data, and the second one is what the harmonized data is. What harmonized means is they tried to get the assumptions to match up. Now, if you look at this, what you can see is jumps out at you right away is that nuclear is comparable to renewable energies. What you also see as you look to the right is that coal is, of course, the worst, and natural gas is somewhat in between the two. Now, where the challenge comes in our economy as it exists right now, is that if you're going to build anything, you're going to probably build natural gas. And natural gas is much worse than nuclear or any of the renewables in terms of its carbon footprint. And it has the additional disadvantage that we're faced with is that it releases methane. And methane is also a greenhouse gas. So not only do you have to worry about the CO2, you have to worry about the methane leaks that occur over it. So in terms of life cycle, nuclear is comparable to the photovoltaics. And actually, interestingly enough, it's actually a little bit better than photovoltaics. One of the studies we had to do here at Brookhaven National Laboratory was demonstrate that photovoltaics, especially thin film photovoltaics, actually, because of their manufacturing process, was actually a little bit lower than nuclear. It was for a particular country that wanted to have absolutely the lowest emissions. And so they were reluctant to allow thin film into their energy mix. Fortunately, the study was able to demonstrate that thin film was a very good technology in terms of carbon footprint.
So I wanted to confirm a few things about
Sure.
this diagram that we're looking at. So it says that it is showing emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So this means that it includes the impact of gases that are not carbon dioxide, like methane, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So I think what it's showing is that even with like other technologies that may exist, like carbon capture, it is possible that nuclear energy and other renewables are less environmentally polluting than fossil fuels.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So I guess moving on, this is a very like important question to ask. Why is it necessary to shift to low emission technology and renewables? And also, what role should nuclear play in this? I know that in California, they've written into law a zero emissions goal, but they have that to include nuclear, like the possibility of nuclear later on. So can you talk a little bit about low emissions technologies and the role that nuclear can have in getting to a zero emission grid?
Well, to me, getting this down to zero emissions as close as possible is absolutely necessary. With we facing the challenges we're having right now. Decarbonization is something that I think is something not a worthwhile goal. I think it's a necessary goal. And the question has always been is can we get to that just using renewables? And it doesn't look like we can. And shall we say, maintain our lifestyle. This is one of the things. There's I shouldn't say it. It's not a very good joke, but there was a standard joke we used to do when we're doing the analysis for trying to get down to zero emissions, carbon emissions, is we know how to do that. It's called the Middle Ages. We just don't think you would like living there. And so it's how we get there and maintain, what we have now is the real challenge. If we don't include nuclear, which right now is in the United States, the largest source of low emissions technology that we have, it just makes that challenge that much more difficult. It's not technically impossible. I'm an engineer, and there's a lot more smarter engineers than me out there. And trust me, we can figure out anything that we can make things work, and you just may not like what that solution looks like. And so when California, I looked at California as being willing to accept the challenge, and I give them credit for it. I just got back from San Francisco. Trust me, anything they can do to get those cars off the road, I would appreciate right now. It's there. It's really not nice there in terms of traffic. But I think that we have to have that. Whether or not we can do that without nuclear, it's a very hard challenge, a very tough goal to do. But that's where we're at. I think it's something we need to do and must be done.
Do you know how much electricity is generated through nuclear energy in the US?
In the United States, it's roughly 20% of our electricity is generated by nuclear right now. There are currently 99 plants in operation. There are 2 under construction. However, of the 99 plants that are in operation, 18 or more are possibly under economic stress and may close. And the reason is because natural gas is so cheap right now that it becomes economically feasible for you to build a new combined cycle gas turbine plant than it is cheaper for you to do the regular maintenance on a nuclear plant. So that's a really tough thing. And as you can see, remember from the graph, a natural gas plant is going to increase our carbon footprint, going to increase our emissions. And that is why, for example, the Union of Concerned Scientists within the past couple of months came out with a paper basically saying, hey, we need to start looking about how we're going to maintain this nuclear fleet because every plant that shuts down is increasing our emissions. That's the reality that we face right now. A nuclear plant shutting down is not going to be replaced by a photovoltaic plant. It's going to be replaced by a natural gas plant. That's just the reality.
Right. Yeah. I think it's really important to consider that the way that the current system of energy generation right now, it's based off of a super resource intensive model of fossil fuels where the waste is pumped into the air. And we have to really grapple with that and consider that when making any changes or deciding to not make any changes at all.
Right.
So I want to say to anyone who's watching right now to please post questions. We're here to answer them. I do have a question from Paul Sawyer, who has two questions.
Sure.
The first question is, what about cooling water impacts? So I guess first, can you explain the role of water in nuclear power generation, and if it's necessary, if this water can be recycled? And also, what is the waste profile for half-lives of component nuclear waste?
Okay, so all right, let me just tackle the first question.
Yeah, let's start with the water one, and then
start with the water one.
Yeah.
So the question has to be broken down into three parts. What's the water footprint when you build it? Because you're going to use a lot of water, for example, in the concrete. Okay, there's a lot of concrete there, so let's put that aside for now. The water footprint is relatively minor or relatively equivalent to other constructions, but not nearly what you wind up with when you construct a dam, for example. Okay,
Right.
On that. The question is, and then in terms of, we use water for cooling. It's a thermal cycle, and so the question is how much is for consumption? In other words, how much do you use and not put back? And how much do you withdraw and put back? And the answer is that for consumption, nuclear is a little bit less than other technologies, thermal cycle technologies. But in terms of withdrawals, it's more normally, okay? And the reason is that because of the thermal cycle that's used for nuclear power plants, it's a little bit less efficient than you can get from a combined cycle gas turbine. So per kilowatt hour, you use a little bit more water for cooling. Now, that's in the way we do it now. That's the way we built them. We don't have to build them that way. And that's been demonstrated at a nuclear power plant in Arizona, Palo Verde. Palo Verde has 3 nuclear reactors. It has a zero consumption profile. And it runs on recycled wastewater from the city of Phoenix. So it takes the water from a sewage treatment plant in the city of Phoenix. It's pumped 36 miles to the Palo Verde plant, where it's used to cool the water through cooling towers, and actually winds up with zero net consumption. and then the gray water is put into a pond and then brought back eventually to the aquifer. So it's really kind of a cool system. So even though most plants don't do that because they didn't have to, they were built on seashores or by rivers, you can absolutely drive that water footprint down to essentially zero for a nuclear plant. There's one other nuclear power plant that uses air cooling. It's in Russia. It's a plant called Bilibido, and it cools with air towers. So you can drive that down to zero if you wish to. Now, what are the half-lives of the nuclear waste, I think was the question. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question is, can you talk about the waste profiles for half-lives of component nuclear waste? So I guess, yeah, just explain a little bit what is done with that, and what is a half-life?
Okay, so let's start with what a half-life is. Yeah. That's an important point.
Yeah.
So a half-life refers to the fact that things that emit radiation change their form when they do that. So in other words, they're changing, basically what we say is they're changing from one element to another. So when something decays, it changes, say, from like iodine to something further lower on the periodic table. So a half-life is how long does it take half of something to undergo this radiation process and become something else? Okay, so during that half-life, you're changing from half of something to something else. Now, where this question becomes very complicated, from what the gentleman asked, is that something else you turn into may also be radioactive. Okay, so it's not just the half-life of that initial thing. And if you'll excuse me, I have no idea why this is a crank call. So let me ignore that on that. That which is interesting. So basically, the overall half-lives are difficult to determine. So the majority of the nuclear waste that is produced has a half-life of much less than 100 years. Okay, that is in aggregate. Okay, what some people refer to when they talk about very long half-lives are the plutonium that is produced as part of the fission process. And plutonium has a very long half-life, okay, to get to something that's stable. And it could be on the order of 100,000 years. That is why we recommend, or the preferred thing is, you reprocess the nuclear fuel, take the plutonium out, put it back in, and fission it again, so that you get it back down to be these radioactive materials that only last about 100 years. The other alternative to that is that we bombard these substances with neutrons or other energetic particles, and again reduce their half-lives down to about 100 years.
Can you explain what types of fuels are used that have half-lives of 100 years? Because I feel like the perception is that the half-life of nuclear
fuel is very, very long.
It's like thousands of years. Yeah, it's like.
Okay. So basically, uranium, every element that's above the element lead in the periodic table.
The number of, what's the word for the number of the periodic number of.
Yeah, so 92 is uranium. Okay, just keep that one in mind. We'll go through the other ones later. Okay. So everyone above that and some of them below it are actually naturally radioactive. Okay, and so that's one thing you have to keep in mind. So the fact that something is radioactive doesn't make it dangerous. It just makes it radioactive sometimes. Okay, so uranium is naturally radioactive. Some of the isotopes have long half-lives. One of the substances we sometimes use is thorium. Thorium has a half-life. Its half-life is longer than the age of the universe.
Wow.
Okay, so in other words, it is for all practical purposes stable, because it's going to be here as long as the universe is here. So you kind of have to distinguish between the fact that it's radioactive and subject to decay as to what that radiation is. So the longer the lived the isotope is, it tends to be what we call an alpha emitter. It emits a helium nucleus. And it does not tend to be a very dangerous substance unless you inhale it. So alpha emitters are bad if you inhale them. So the substances that we use, the fissionable substances we use, are uranium, plutonium, and we sometimes use thorium as what we call a breeding isotope. So we put thorium in a reactor, convert it to uranium, and then use that. So those are the three fissionable elements that we tend to use in the reactors.
That was a really good explanation. Thank you. So we have a few more questions from our audience. Another question from Paul Sawyer. Germany has a goal of eliminating nuclear power.
Yes.
Why? How do they replace their energy stream?
You don't want to know. No, I will tell you. Basically, that is correct. The German government, after the Fukushima accident, decided that they were going to eliminate nuclear power as part of their energy mix. This has had an unfortunate consequence for them in that although they have the laudable goal of eventually going to renewable energies, right now they've been switching over to coal plants. And if you remember the graph that Jenny put up, the substance that's all the way to the right is the coal plant. So right now in Germany, their carbon emissions are increasing at a rapid rate. They are trying to put in additional wind and photovoltaics, but they're having to subsidize those at a fairly high rate right now. And although they're having some good success with the wind, the photovoltaics isn't going well. And as a result, there are some parts of Germany right now where it's costing you, and this is not a good statistic. I mean, don't quote this. I mean, for the entire time, but there are times in Germany right now when you would pay $40 a kilowatt hour for photovoltaic electricity. Yeah, I know, and that's kind of scary. They also kind of cheated initially in that some of the countries that surround them, like France and the Czech Republic, have nuclear power plants. And they kind of cheated by buying the electricity from the adjacent countries and said, well, you know, it's really not nuclear, but it really is. So actually, they have a minister of energy right now whose sole job is to make sure that they don't buy nuclear. And I don't know how they do that. They still import electricity from these other countries, but somehow they have the electrons branded as being non-nuclear.
Wow. So it seems like in the attempt to respond to what are, I guess, legitimate safety concerns, they're kind of just emitting more pollutants into the environment. It just seems counterintuitive. Or
Yeah,
raising costs for people.
Policy questions like that are always tough. And, you know, the German government has made this policy decision, and the short-term consequences for it are very real right now.
Right. So we have another 3 questions from the audience. I'll start with the first one. You talked about mobile or 4th generation nuclear. How quickly will we see that, and what is the capacity versus the cost of using this type of nuclear?
Okay, so let me answer the second question first. The capacity of small modular reactors is defined as being something less than 300 megawatts electric. To put that in perspective, a current generation nuclear power plant would be 1,000 megawatts electric or more. Some of the small modular reactors are as low as 50 megawatts electric. So they're relatively small. The reason people are interested in them is that they can put them online as much as they need them. Okay, so there's a certain attraction into only putting 50 megawatts on as opposed to putting 1,000 megawatts on. It makes it easier for you to finance that. Also, a small modular reactor integrates better with renewables. Okay, so if you have a large wind farm and the wind farm is a variable source, you know, for the most part, if it's big enough, it's pretty stable. But you want something that is an additional 50 megawatts that can load follow to make your grid very stable. That's a very good attraction for small modular reactors. The goal is to reduce the operating costs and the capital costs roughly comparable to what you get from a gas turbine. I don't know if that's achievable, but that's their goal. There was another question, I think, on microreactors, was it?
Mobile or 4th generation?
Oh, 4th generation. Yeah. A 4th generation reactor is not the same as a small modular reactor. A 4th generation reactor was defined by a group associated with the Nuclear Energy Agency, which is a agency which is in Paris, France. And there were 6 designs. The designs tend to be large. They tend to be not light water reactors, which are the kind that we have now, but they all have characteristics that make them, for example, want to be load follow. In other words, they're designed to be better integrate with renewables on a grid. They also tend to be much more efficient in terms of the use of resources. So they'll use less uranium than the current generation of reactors. So it's two different things. One is kind of like an improved version of what we have now. That's generation 4. A small modular reactor is something that's specifically designed to reduce the capital cost and designed to integrate with a renewable grid.
Right, because I often hear people who are kind of skeptical of renewable energy. They're always saying like, "Oh, well, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always."
Have you been listening to President Trump again on his speeches? Don't do that.
Yeah, and it seems to me like what you're saying is that if you were to integrate into a renewable energy grid, nuclear power, then it could potentially resolve all of these issues.
There's all right now, for example, with and I'm a firm believer in all of the above. I think you need all of the above to get to where we need to go. And so there is a variability with regards to most renewables. Hydro, it tends to be less variable than others. Solar is variable, but we tend to be able to predict it. And the same thing we're getting there with wind being able to have a very good prediction on. Yes, so that variability can be compensated for by small modular reactors. That's kind of one of our goals. Right now, for example, to compensate for the variability in wind, in the United States, we have installed 5 gigawatts of reciprocating engine systems. Now, reciprocating engine, for those who are not engineers, that's the kind of engine you have in your car, okay, or in a truck. That's a reciprocating engine. And a gigawatt is the size of a large nuclear power plant. So we have installed in the United States to compensate for the variability of renewables, especially wind, 5 nuclear equivalent of 5 nuclear power plants worth of reciprocating engines. In Texas alone, we have put in nearly 1 gigawatt of reciprocating engines. And that cuts down, because they run on natural gas or oil or whatever, doesn't help us in getting to that zero emissions goal. So
wait, you're saying that to compensate for the variability of renewable energy, in some places they're making fossil fuel burning plants?
Yes, that's correct.
That sounds
very engines, yeah. So it's not even like a gas turbine. It's like a engine you put in a bus.
Oh, wow. That sounds very polluting, and like as if they don't want to reach the goal of net zero by 2050.
Well, it's not super polluting, but the point is it does add to the emissions bill that we have to pay.
Right. Yeah. So here's another question from our audience. This is from Manasi Kurad. Sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. It's I'm sorry. So nuclear reactor, can it create the contamination of soil and water nearby? Can it be feasible to shift to technology that can harm the environment? So what technologies can you do to overcome these potentially polluting outcomes?
Okay. Okay. So I think what he's asking is are there emissions from power plants that get outside the boundary? On the boundary. And the answer to that question is that under normal operations, there are in effect insignificant emissions of radiation outside the boundary. That's by law. So can you have an accident in which you would have emissions outside the boundary? Yes. That does happen, and that can happen. And are there emissions of radioactive substances during normal operation? And again, the answer is yes. But then those emissions are also limited by law. So can you reduce those even further? And the answer is yes. You could build a Generation 4 nuclear power plant or put on a small modular reactor, all of which have even more reduced emissions.
Right. And like you said before, there are currently, like in Arizona, there's nuclear power plants that recycle water. So it's
correct,
really
yes.
possible to do this with the right regulation and the right technologies.
Yeah.
So your background, you've worked in the Department of Energy for a while, and you had a lead role with the Department of Energy's response to the Chernobyl disaster.
Yes.
So can you explain a little bit what went wrong and what nuclear accidents have in common, how they differ, and if these technologies and practices are being used, or what needs to be done to prevent this from ever happening again?
Okay. So yeah, the Chernobyl accident is very interesting, and I will talk about the three major nuclear accidents that have occurred and why they're all different. So I got involved with Chernobyl because I was very interested in a technology called combined heat and power. That is a way to increase the efficiency of centralized power generation, in that the hot water, the water that you normally would discharge that's slightly raised in temperature back into the rivers or the lakes or the ocean, you use to heat the adjacent city. And that was kind of like my specialty. And it turns out that all of the Russian nuclear power plants do that. They all provide what's called district heat to the local city. So that's where my expertise came in. And so that's how I became involved with it, because I knew about the plants on it. So the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a design that didn't look like any other designs anywhere else in the world. It was what we called a light water reactor. So it uses, light water means the water we have, you use. There's another term called heavy water, which is an isotope in which we replace the hydrogen with an isotope called deuterium, which is the type of reactor that's used in Canada. Canadians use heavy water moderated reactors. But the Russians were the only ones to use light water graphite moderated reactors. This had the unfortunate design problem that what we called a positive power coefficient, which is something you don't want, okay? And the easiest way to think about a positive power coefficient is you're driving in your car, you step on the gas, the car speeds up, okay? And eventually, though, the car hits a standard speed, which is faster than it was before. With a positive power coefficient, you step on the gas and the car keeps speeding up until you hit the brake. And that's the Chernobyl reactor had that design flaw in it. Under certain conditions, it could have a positive power coefficient. So that if you said, I wanted to have more power, and you wanted to load follow, say somebody wants more power for you, you do that. And all of a sudden, they wanted more power until it overheated and overpressurized and blew itself up. So there was no brake that they could put on. Yeah.
I think it broke up on it. Can you react to
Oh, I'm sorry, you're breaking up on me.
Oh no. Okay. Okay, cool. So can you go back 2 sentences maybe, and then
So basically, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor, because of its unique design, had what we called a positive power coefficient. So the more you increased the power, the higher it kept getting, to the point that it actually blew itself up. And it had in it a so that's what caused it. So it was a very different design. The design doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And the Russians, to their credit, have been shutting down this type of design. It's called an RBMK. If you're into Russian, it basically stands for Graphite Bolshoya Moderated Kinetica, which means large graphite moderated reactor. And they are, to their credit, shutting these plants down. They know that, and replacing them with modern reactors. The other two major ones, so that's a design flaw. The plant wasn't designed right, and it did it in. The other two major ones are the 3 Mile Island plant in the United States, which led to no serious emissions of radioactivity. And that's one that's studied to this day. But basically, at that plant, the operator shut down the safety systems and caused a partial meltdown of the plant. The radioactive substances were contained in the containment building, and therefore the actual result was an economic loss of the plant, but not an environmental loss such as occurred at Chernobyl, where there is still an exclusion zone where you're not supposed to be living, although people do live there now. They really shouldn't be. The last one that's led to a large one is Fukushima. And at Fukushima, it's kind of a combination of the two things. The plant there had a different kind of containment system, which worked on the assumption that you were going to vent things. And because of the type of thing that happened, which was a total station blackout, they actually were not able to run the safety systems like they wanted to. So the safety systems didn't function there because of this total blackout. Interestingly enough, there's another nuclear power plant, which is about 6 miles up the road, Fukushima Daini, which got through the tsunami and the earthquake perfectly fine. And it all had to do with just the fact that they had a slightly different offsite power system than Fukushima Daiichi did. So, and in that case, it's a total economic loss and an environmental loss. So that is something that does happen when you have a nuclear accident.
Right. So
the only person that died at the Fukushima, the immediate death of the Fukushima Daiichi plant was the plant manager who died of a heart attack.
Out of fear. Got it.
No, overwork. So.
Okay, overwork. So it seems like what you're saying is that in the 3 very high-profile nuclear accidents, most of them they were all caused by what can be described as design flaws or things that can ultimately be fixed or regulated to prevent these things from ever happening.
In one case, I would say definitely in Chernobyl, it's a design flaw. And in the other cases, I would place it more as operational flaws. In other words, the operators didn't do what the designers told them to do on that. And yes, that can be overcome. The 4th generation plants are all designed to be passively safe. In other words, they do not need electric power to shut down safely. That's part of their design.
Okay. So I guess moving on to the nuclear fuel itself, there have been environmental justice activists, and particularly Native American activists. They've noted that uranium mining since the 1950s has disproportionately affected Native American communities. The same goes with how France gets its nuclear power now from Kazakhstan, Canada, and also Niger. It's been linked with water pollution and perhaps even cancer. Is there a way to make nuclear power more fair, and what can be done about this?
So there's, and I want to say, this is truly an environmental justice issue. All mining of both actinides, which are the uraniums and the thoriums and everything else, and the lanthanides have been, which are the rare earths, which are used in permanent magnets, has not been as environmentally sound as they should be in terms of their practices. And, the easy answer is to say well, just do it environmentally correctly, but you should not, for example, be doing things where you're doing acid baths, you know, to separate out the minerals in situ. That's a bad thing to do. And that's on the mining end. The mining end is to follow the best practices. And right now, for example, though, by the way, the number, so just let you know, we do very little uranium mining left in the United States. Most of uranium mining these days is done in Kazakhstan. About 27% of the uranium that's mined is mined in Kazakhstan. Another 22% comes from Canada. Only about 2% of the uranium in the world is mined in the United States. Nonetheless, we should, and we do this with all mining, is mining should be done in the most environmentally sound way. Now, that's step one. Step two is if we were to engage in what we call a closed nuclear fuel cycle, we could stop mining uranium. We have everything we need if it goes to a closed nuclear fuel cycle. But right now, we only put the uranium into our reactors once, and then we take it out. If we were to reprocess the uranium, we could substantially cut down on the amount of new material, new uranium that we need to mine.
Can you explain how a closed nuclear fuel cycle works? Are you saying that uranium can be recycled?
Yes, absolutely. So right now, in fact, it's already practiced in France, Japan, Russia, and the United Kingdom. All reprocess their nuclear fuel. So basically, what happens is in this process of nuclear fission, some of the fission products is what we call it, when the uranium atom splits apart, cause the reaction to slow down to the point that it is no longer feasible to keep using the uranium. What we need to do is take those fission products out that slow the reaction down out. And we do that by reprocessing. By doing that, we can put the uranium back in and fission it again. Right now, we use only approximately 2% of the energy content of the uranium. And by using the reprocessing, we can get that up to 50, 60%. So it's a huge increase in the amount of the energy within the uranium we can get out. So that's a tremendous thing. Right now, for example, like I say, Japan does it. UK has always done it. France does it. And Russia does it. Russia sells nuclear power plants overseas. And one of the things they do is they always take the uranium back and reprocess it and then send it back.
Wow, it sounds like this process makes it like 30 times more efficient. Like,
it increases the efficiency tremendously, but also what it does is the amount of nuclear waste that you have to dispose of permanently goes way, way down, and the half-life of that nuclear waste goes way, way down. So it's very good. We in the U.S. don't practice it because there's always a catch, right? The catch is that when we do that, there is one part of the steps where it might be possible to divert the uranium or the plutonium into nuclear weapons. And that's why we have an International Atomic Energy Agency with inspectors to make sure that doesn't happen. But in the United States, we do not feel that that's our policy. We do not reprocess.
That sounds kind of wasteful, but I don't know about that.
Policy decisions are always tough. There's always trade-offs. And, you know, that's why it's very important for all your students to study these issues. So when it's their turn to advise the decision makers that they can, you know, translate technology into policy effectively.
Right, exactly. So can you give us a visualization of how many resources are required to generate nuclear energy compared to other forms of energy? Because I didn't really realize this until I started researching it. Like the size of like these fuel cells, like it pales in comparison to how much resources are required for fossil fuel extraction.
Well, it's interesting in that so there's a couple ways of looking at the footprint. One is you could just look at the land that you need for the power plant itself, okay? And, you know, there's various studies that have been done. but on a kilowatt basis, a nuclear power plant requires, some people have estimated, 1/10 to 1/100th of the land of a photovoltaic plant. So the footprint of the plant itself is very tiny, okay, in terms of how much energy you're getting out of it. Okay, now let's look at the other footprints. We've talked about water. We know that the water footprint can be driven very, very small. What we're then talking about is the footprint for the mining, you know, the extraction footprint and the processing footprint, and then the disposal footprint as to how we can get those down. And that's a tough one. And the disposal footprint, if you reprocess, is small. Even if you don't reprocess, there's a company called Holtec, which says that you can basically store all of the nuclear fuel rods ever generated and that you're ever going to use in the United States in a very small area in New Mexico, okay, which is the size of a couple football fields. So that, oh, there go the lights. All right, I'm moving back and forth. Everybody don't panic. It's an energy efficiency thing here we have at Brookhaven. I'm on a timer if I don't move. And that part is that. So I would say if you're reprocessing, that footprint's tiny, okay? And also, I want to speak up for reprocessing, because reprocessing is not only important for nuclear, reprocessing is really, really important for photovoltaics. Photovoltaics lose about 2% of their effectiveness every year, okay? So after a lifetime of a plant, say 20 to 40 years, that effectiveness is going down. But if we take those PV panels and reprocess them, that's a great reduction in the environmental footprint of PV too. So I'm a firm believer in reprocessing everything that we can get our hands on. And I think that's very, very important. Coal, we're just never going to get that footprint down no matter what we do. I love Klaus Lochner and his plans for carbon sequestration by CO2 mining and everything else. But I just think, you know, anybody who's ever lived next to a coal plant and seen the leaching ponds and the ash ponds and the ash pits realizes that that footprint is just never going to get small.
Right, exactly. So I guess to summarize again, it seems like nuclear energy, there are definitely trade-offs, but there are ways to make it more efficient. And if it is integrated into an energy system that is built on zero emissions or low emissions technology, then it can make it all just more efficient and more effective. So I guess we're starting to wrap up now. We should just have a quick conversation about climate change and what needs to be done to prevent it. So what role do you think nuclear should play in curbing emissions in moving forward into the future? And what kinds of policies do you think would make it so that it's doable?
I think nuclear plays a role. I think photovoltaics plays a role. I think wind plays a role. Hydro plays. I think everything plays a role in it. Nuclear's role with the current generation and Generation 4 is clearly going to be, how do you drop 1 gigawatt of low emissions energy in a small footprint onto your grid? Okay. And so if you're a particular type of developing country, that's a tremendous advantage to you. If you're a developed country like the United States, you want to maintain your 20% under all circumstances. You don't want to get worse in terms of that. In terms of zero emissions and low emissions carbon, I would say the important point is that nuclear be treated the same as renewables. If you're going to do things like that. I live in a state. We have what's called RGGI, which you're familiar with, the regional greenhouse gas emissions, which is a cap and trade system. And nuclear was deliberately not made eligible for that system, but we now have what are called zero emission credits. So you can buy nuclear zero emission credits, which will help you with that. So I think all that is important. I can't emphasize enough that we have to get to a zero emissions future. We can't keep doing what we're doing now. It's not going to be easy. But I truly believe that we have made advances in technology that will enable us to do that and actually improve our standard of living. I don't think a zero emissions future has to be, and I'm sorry, if I'm offending anybody, I really got offended at President Trump's speech at CPAC when he kind of did the dig on wind. You got to watch TV right now because the wind's blowing. I find that highly offensive, and because it's not the reality. Our renewable energy future should be even better, and a zero emissions future should be even better than what we have right now. And it should be, something that we have this expression consumer utility function. Our consumer utility function should be what they call the bliss factor. Everything should be really, really good for us. It should not be a sacrifice. It should be a higher standard of living that we have now. So that's my feeling about why we want to go to zero emissions. That it's going to be a really great thing, and it's going to raise the standard of living for everybody. So that's my speech.
All right, thank you. And I guess just to go back on something you said before, like because of this, I guess, stigma towards nuclear energy, which is based off of nuclear energy models that are frankly outdated and based off of technologies that aren't even used anymore, or practices that are no longer allowed. There are countries and states that have, instead of embracing nuclear, have instead invested more into fossil fuels, and which is just totally counterintuitive and not compatible with the future that we're trying to build.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so I guess we're gonna end this session soon. Do you have any closing comments that you would like to have?
I would just say I'm very glad you're all participating in this course. I think this is very important. The SDSN, I think, is a very important contributor to getting to where I would like to see our future to be. And I can't, I think it's very good that they offer this, and that I think, like I said before, I'm an all of the above kind of guy. There are nothing that we should be discarding that's going to help us get to this sustainable future that we need. And I think it's going to happen. May not happen in my lifetime, but I hope it does. But I think we're getting there. And, I've always been, don't listen to the politicians who say it can't happen. We got to make it happen. The technologies can be developed if they're not out there already, and it is going to be fantastic. So that's what I'm going to say. It's going to be even better than what they said at Disney World when I was growing up.
Right, yeah, it's like, just imagine how great the future is going to be, right?
Exactly.
So thank you for participating. Thank you to all of our viewers. And to those viewers who are not currently enrolled in our climate action course, it is online, so you can still watch and answer and interact with other people who are taking this course, so please do that. And we will have more live Q&A sessions coming up soon. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week, and let's build a better future.
Thank you.
Cool.